started as a students' union, using our privileges as Israelis, as Hebrew speakers, as Israeli lawyers later, to challenge some of the occupation's policies. And
just to be clear, the weight of that is in establishing a precedent that could end up doing more damage than good, correct?
absolutely, and that is
Okay.
correct both for
Most Americans have never seen an Israeli military court. Who do they govern? What rights exist? What rights don't exist?
actually most of the cases that we litigate are.
Speaking of democracy, Palestinians who are arrested and imprisoned by Israel end up going to an Israeli-run organization for help. Is that by design, meaning that as a practical matter, Palestinian lawyers can't actually represent their own people effectively in Israeli courts? I'm curious about how you build trust with Palestinian clients when you're asking them to place their faith in an Israeli institution.
Well, the answer is going to be very layered because the situation is complicated. First,
You mentioned some of the civil society organizations that are actually founded by Palestinians themselves. The U.S. has designated some of those organizations. From your perspective, how significantly has that handicapped the work?
well, the first state to designate them and try and blacklist them was.
You've also stated publicly that what has happened in Israeli detention facilities constitutes torture implemented as state policy, not a casual claim. What I want to ask you about is what the legal and institutional response within Israel has been.
So first to the Israeli reaction.
How is that possible? In what universe is it possible that there is actual video footage of something that is perhaps the greatest torture that can be conceived? That footage has been viewed around the world, and then those allegations are dismissed.
I can answer that with a story that I've heard about one of the winter soldiers, the American soldiers that came back from the Vietnam War.
What does justice or accountability even look like for a person who survives abuse of that magnitude?
First of all, we know the torture and ill treatment are.
Al Jazeera reported that Israel has worked to keep media and independent legal professionals out of these facilities like State and Line, similar to the access restrictions at, let's say, Guantanamo. Have you been inside this particular prison? How much do you believe that the publicity around this specific case that we discussed of the prisoner who was raped by a gang increases the risk of harm to the detainee, understanding that generally prison systems culture has a well-documented reputation for being retributory?
So there definitely is a risk. Some of our clients were specifically told by prison guards.
Hal, for people like me, though, who are horrified by much of what we've discussed but powerless, what kinds of support actually help you in cases like this? What can we do?
First of all,
My guest today is Tal Steiner, Executive Director of HaMoked, Center for the Defense of the Individual, and formerly Executive Director of the Public Committee Against Torture in Israel. She is a lawyer, she is Israeli, and she has spent her career documenting what Israeli state power does to Palestinian bodies and families, using the courts to challenge what she believes violates fundamental human rights. HaMoked was founded in 1988, born of the first Intifada. For nearly 4 decades, it has operated at the intersection of Israeli law, military administration, and the occupied territories. In 2025 alone, HaMoked processed nearly 30,000 tracing requests, 4 times its normal caseload, through litigation, emergency legal assistance, detainee tracing, freedom of movement cases, prison conditions litigation, and advocacy against torture. Tal's work has become part of the legal infrastructure protecting Palestinian prisoners. While much of the world's attention has focused on governments and armies, Tal's work has focused on individuals, the family searching for a disappeared son, the detainee whose location is unknown, the farmer trying to reach his land, the resident trying not to lose legal status. Today, I want to talk not only about law, but about what it costs to spend a career insisting that human rights remain human rights even during war. Tal, I have felt the warmth of your friendship through our correspondence, and of course, we've tried to meet in person, but circumstances outside of our control have prevented that. Thank you for making the time to appear on this episode of Witness.
thank you so much for having me.
Let's start off with some biographical information.
I've been a lawyer for 15 years. HaMoked, the organization I'm running now, was actually my first job out of law school. I studied law here in the Hebrew University in Jerusalem and returned to direct the organization that I'm so very proud of. It's been such a privilege to lead it over the past 7 or 8 months now. Despite everything that we've gone through, including the circumstances that prevented you and I from meeting in Washington earlier this year because of the Israel-US-Iran war that engulfed the area.
I'm also so impressed by its work, and I want to dive right into that. Can you describe for us what it is, who calls you, what happens when the phone rings right there behind you at your office?
So HaMoked, as you said, has been founded in 1988. It started as a students' union, just trying to assist individuals wherever they can, using some of our privileges as Israelis, as Hebrew speakers, as Israeli lawyers later along the line, to challenge some of the occupation's policies and the harm that it does to Palestinian lives, livelihoods, everyday lives, rights, families. Today, we are an organization of about 20 people, and most what we focus about would be individual protection. It would be firstly through the tracing of detainees, because when a detainee, when a Palestinian is detained by Israeli forces in the occupied territories, their families are never made aware of their whereabouts, or not even a confirmation of their arrest. So the first thing people can do is to call HaMoked, and they've been doing that for almost 40 years. We're one of the first phone calls people would make to learn if indeed their relative is held by Israel and where and in what condition. And then later on, if we're able to, we would also visit that person in prison and try and ascertain his condition, his living situation, his health, etc. But we do a lot of work beyond prisons. We represent Palestinian residents of East Jerusalem who live here under a temporary type of residency status, not as citizens, which Israel is constantly trying to push out and away from Jerusalem into the West Bank. And so we each year would represent over 200 families in an ongoing battle to help them sustain and remain here together in Jerusalem, their hometown. We represent hundreds and sometimes thousands of residents of what is called the seam zone, the area caught between the separation barrier and the green line separating Israel proper from the occupied territories, whose lives has been completely upheavaled since the erection of the wall, and even more so since October 23, when the restrictions that guide their lives have become so much stronger. So we try to preserve their freedom of movement and their ability to either live inside the seam zone, because many people actually live within that no man's land, as well as their access to agricultural lands, to businesses, and their abilities to sustain. One of the things HaMoked does best is provide top-notch legal aid, one person, one family at a time, as much as we can afford it, for as much capacity as we have to protect individuals.
This sounds a lot to me like public defense, and a lot of what you're saying attests to a strong sense of disempowerment and having to muster tremendous courage to fight state systems. It takes special people to do that kind of work. Could you describe what drew you into this work?
Me personally, I mean, I grew up in a very, very different landscape. My family are both modern Orthodox and Zionist. So the narrative that I grew up on is miles away from where I am right now. I think it took getting to know a lot of good people in the Hebrew University. It was the years when the first demonstrations in Sheikh Jarrah started against the settlement expansion into East Jerusalem neighborhoods that woke me up to some of the things happening just under my nose here in Jerusalem. I spent some years volunteering at the Jerusalem Rape Crisis Center, and I think that taught me a lot about working with people affected by trauma and working on difficult issues that are dark, that are some of the places most people would not want to look at. Moving from there to HaMoked, and then several years to representing asylum seekers and victims of human trafficking, and then obviously the Committee Against Torture kind of led me full circle to confront again what I believe is the number one issue that we as Jewish Israelis have to face, which is the occupation and its consequences to the people that we've been occupying for almost 60 years now.
Is there any other work that you could see yourself doing, or do you believe this is your life's calling?
I can't imagine myself doing anything else. I mean, it's different doing it as a lawyer than doing it as a director. My concerns right now are a bit different. I no longer wear the rope and storm into the halls of the courts, which I'm also a bit grateful for because it could be some very frustrating spaces. My challenge now is to lead an organization, meaning to understand, first of all, how to sustain it in a space that is constantly shrinking, both financially, politically. The threats that we're facing are nothing like what we faced when I started off here, as well as strategizing and understanding the impact of our work, because it can never be just about individual representation. Individual representation always has to accumulate and to create something bigger if it's through strategic litigation, if it's through advocacy. And then who do we advocate? Domestic politicians, national politics? Do we approach the international community, and whom in the international community? That's also an issue that has been politicized in many ways, including through some of the current US administration's decisions and actions. So to navigate those waters, I think, is what I'm doing right now. And I'm very proud to be doing that. That's the truth. I'm privileged with working with some of the most committed, professional, morally awake people that this region can offer. And that has been a great comfort and relief even through some of the worst times that we've endured here over the past few years.
Yeah, you can't do it alone. I know that. You've raised many things that I want to come back to. But before I do, people hear human rights lawyer, they imagine speeches. Describe for me what a Tuesday morning is like. What does your staff actually do?
So my staff can be either the intake coordinators who sit at the desk and are bombarded by phone calls from 8 in the morning until when the lines are cut off, receiving tracing requests, over 100 such requests. So those would be mothers, sisters, fathers calling from either the West Bank, Gaza, or East Jerusalem saying, my son, my husband, my brother has been arrested. Can you find out where they are? And then we start taking them through the season of getting an answer back to them, which means we have to file a request with the Israeli authorities, get an answer, relay it back to the family. And if we don't get an answer, what do we do then? And then it goes one step above, which is the case managers. The case managers receive all this data from the intake department and have to, it's kind of like a triage. What do I do? Who do I approach this? Whom in the Israeli military attorney general, police, who is responsible for this issue? And then if the case managers can't resolve it, then you would take it up to the lawyers. And the lawyers and the head of the legal department would sit together with their team and decide, okay, do we have a case here? What's the case? What's the instance that we have to approach? Is it the Court of Appeals? Is it the district? Is it the Supreme? Do we have enough for strategic litigation? Do we need partners for this strategic litigation? Do we need more evidence? And then our advocacy coordinator would make sure that he reports on everything that we do, that we upload all this information, all this knowledge, trends that we identify, and the work that we're doing to our website, to diplomats, to journalists, to people like you who are interested in our work, to make sure that we raise as much awareness and create a sense of urgency that we know is crucial. It's never enough to rely only on litigation, especially in Israel in the current political context, when the courts are already so compromised. We have to use every strategy under our belts. And that's a Tuesday. It's very intense.
You mentioned a staff of 20. For that, 20 is a drop in the bucket. Do you feel like you are, as another person had told me, mopping the ocean? And is it a function of people being afraid to do the type of work that you do? Or is it a function of the political landscape where people maybe don't believe in the work that you do? Another question I have is, you described a team setting where there are determinations being made on whether or not a case can be accepted and elevated. How do you make that determination? What is a case that's viable?
The first question is difficult. I think anybody who's ever worked in human rights knows that no matter how much capacity we have, how much energy, how much we want to save everyone, you really never can't. And this is an illusion that to sustain in this work, you have to get rid of very fast. We call it the Superman or Superwoman complex. And never will we save all the people that are suffering, especially in such a widespread apparatus of oppression that is the Israeli occupation of Palestine. But of course, we would always want to do more. I think the only limitation is our financial capacity. If I had double the budget, I would trace double the people. I would handle double the cases. There used to be times where we were richer and had a bigger staff. What we're lacking right now is mostly the mobilization of donors to believe in the work that we do, to believe that there's a future to this place, because we are seeing some donors backing away from the Israeli-Palestinian situation. Perhaps they're frustrated because they don't see a light at the end of the tunnel, or they want to divert their funds to other emergencies around the globe, which is also understandable. And there are other factors that affect that. But the only thing limiting us is capacity, really, because the professionalism, the drive, the motivation, it's here. And if I could have raised double the people.
I want to help you do that more than you know, Tal.
I think this is
But
helping.
is HaMoked, is it essentially the only sort of legal aid that does this specific work? You had also mentioned partners, or are there sister organizations that you collaborate with?
We're definitely not the only organization. Actually, one of the things that makes Palestinian and Israeli civil societies special is really how varied they are, how many organizations are there. We do something that is special to HaMoked. No other organization represents that many people, that many individual cases. Not many organizations have the capacity to handle our workload, especially with tracing, but also with East Jerusalem and the Sim Zone. Those are specific issues that no other organization that I know has the same expertise and capacity. But there are definitely other organizations who conduct prison visits, who collect testimonies of torture and ill treatment in detention, who monitor zoning and landing rights and annexation efforts by the Israeli government. There are many organizations who do terrific work. We're definitely not alone in this. But yes, HaMoked, I mean, to me is still a very special place, but with the level of expertise and professionalism and commitment and the capacity to treat that many people, I think in that we're unparalleled.
The other question, of course, was what are the guidelines around determining that a case could potentially be viable?
So if we're talking about an individual case, it's pretty straightforward. You look at the situation your client is presenting, you understand what the law says, and do you have grounds for success? And if you have reasonable grounds to succeed in their case, then you go ahead with it. And oftentimes success is a very limited notion. When we're talking about residency in East Jerusalem, families would have to approach the courts on average 3 or 4 times until they reach a resolution, because the Ministry of Interior is notoriously late in responding to requests and to procedures. And oftentimes you would have to go to court just to get a response. If it's a negative, then you have to go to court again. And if the court rejects you, what are the chances that I'll be able to allow hundreds more? The Court of Appeals, then you have to appeal to the district and then maybe even consider appealing to the Supreme. When we're talking about strategic litigation, it gets more interesting because we have to understand what we're seeing. We have to see, is this a phenomenon? Is this a trend? If I litigate this case, what would be the broader effect that this would bring to a larger constituency? If I, for example, take on the issue of Israel's failure to document arrests, would this protect more people from the prospect of them being enforcedly disappeared? If I tackle this procedure that has to do with the access of farmers into their lands in the Sim Zone, demolitions of people convicted of terrorism, to enter in the next harvest time. So firstly, just identify the reality that we're looking at. And then the second thing is to assess the legal grounds that I'm standing on. Am I trying to challenge a law? Am I trying to make the state obey a law? What are some of the political implications of what I'm doing? How well is this going to be received? And if not, how do I prepare myself? Because HaMoked often litigates cases that are extremely controversial for the mainstream Israeli Jewish perspective. We have protested house demolitions of people convicted of terrorism. To most Israelis, that is very difficult. We are currently protecting detainees from Gaza, which in the eyes of Israelis are all perpetrators of the October 7 atrocities and war crimes. This is extremely difficult. And our lawyers have paid prices for litigating such cases. So you also have to take that into calculation. Okay, I'm taking this case, but here is the price here that I'm going to have to pay And how do I mitigate those? Who are my partners? Who do I go to court with? Who can echo what I'm saying and give me more information and validate what I'm saying from another perspective? So, for example, do I need lawyers here? Do I need doctors? Am I going to ask physicians for human rights? Do I need a perspective of the Palestinian minority within Israel? I go to Adala, etc. So you have to build the right coalition, base yourself in the right evidence, be very strategic. Also consider what would be the price of losing. This is extremely important because oftentimes we want just to protest this awful law that we're saying, but we also have to consider that the court, and oftentimes that is the case, would not necessarily be in our favor. And if that happens, what damage can it cause? If I miss this case, if this case is rejected, what more damage have I caused versus the status quo as it is? But this is the fun part of the work. This is the intellectual challenge, but also the weight of the responsibility that you can feel when you tackle such a question.
And Tal, just to be clear, the weight of that is in establishing a precedent that could end up doing more damage than good, correct?
Absolutely. And that is
Okay.
correct both for individual cases, but also if, for example, you're trying to challenge a policy or a law, and then to find that policy or law upheld by the Supreme Court means that this is the new reality that you would have to face, and it will be much harder to attack it a second time.
Is there a statistical breakdown you can give in terms of cases that come through the door and then cases that are accepted and taken further along the journey, and then cases that are won? How varied are those numbers? And with respect to the cases that you're successful on, do you find that outcome is often dependent on the personality of the judge or the prosecutor that you're in front of or that you're up against? Is it a personality-driven industry?
So the success rates depends on the context and the issue that we're treating. If we define success as being able to trace a detainee, then the percent is close to 100% success. Most times, even for people from Gaza, for example, we would be able to trace a person and let the family know if they're held by Israel and where. And that is very significant, especially for Gazan detainees, but really for all detainees. Since the Red Cross Committee, the ICRC, has been completely banned, we are one of the only lifelines that they have to their family members. So there you could say success rate is high. But then if you look at the numerous petitions that we've filed trying to elevate their living conditions, trying to investigate the incredible death toll that has occurred in the Israeli prisons since 2023, then our success rate is close to zero. In very rare cases has the court intervened on behalf of general living conditions, overcrowding, complaints of torture and ill treatment for Palestinian detainees. When you look to East Jerusalem, our success rate is one of the highest. 90 cases of the cases that we take on are won because we're good at what we do, because the law is on our side, because the systems that we tackle are so malfunctioning that any decent court would just have to allow us the win because we're right on the merits and we're right on the procedures. With same zone cases where there is more of an influence of also expert materials, different security opinions that are very hard to challenge, their success rates drops to around 70%, which still is, I think, a pretty good rate, which enables most our clients, most of the time, some measure of a normal livelihood and just life around the same zone. Having litigated so many individual cases, your chances of success are higher. If you only do strategic litigation and lose, and we'll talk in a bit why that happens so often in Israel, you could be discouraged very soon. But each personal case, one individually, is a world unto itself. To the family that's being able to reunite, for the farmer who's able to farm his ancestral land, this is a world entire, and this is what we try and keep in mind. Why are some of our cases lost? Is a good question. Firstly, I think human rights work generally around the world usually is not triumphant. I don't think we're special in that. But we also have to consider that the Israeli legal system has been severely compromised by the Israeli government for over 4 years now, from already 2022, when this government took power. And we're just headed for election now after it completed its full term of 4 years. Its number one ambition was to dismantle the legal infrastructure, the separation of powers, to attack all the gatekeepers. And you could really see how much the court is being deterred by those actions, by those very personal, sometimes attacks on Supreme Court judges, on the president of the courts, on the attorney general. You could really see them, in a sense, choosing their battles, choosing their rhetoric. And all of that happened already before October 2023. And then October 2023 just changed the narrative in Israel in such a profound way. What used to be more in the margins of Israeli speak, when we had the occupation, we had mass military invasions into Gaza and into the West Bank. In a sense, nothing is new in what happened in Gaza, but in another sense, it's a completely new atmosphere. The dehumanization of Palestinian lives by the mainstream Israeli Jewish society is not something that we have ever witnessed. It became almost a taboo to speak of Palestinians as human beings worthy of the same rights. There were even polls recently published citing 80% of Jewish Israelis believing that after October 7, any kind of action towards Gaza residents is justified. And 60% of Jewish Israelis said they agree with the phrase, there are no innocent people in Gaza. This is the mindset. This is the society that we work from within. And when you look at the courts, at the judges, they're part of that society. So either they agree with those sayings, but they hide it under a shroud of legitimacy, or they shy away from it and they refuse to get involved in cases that are too controversial. And for human rights work in Israel, defending Palestinian human rights is controversial. So oftentimes we would lose, not because this or that specific judge, but because the atmosphere towards human rights has changed so dramatically in Israel, and that affects everything.
Is that intensification of atmosphere attributable to, first and foremost, the politicians, and then that mindset is transferred to, for example, the media, and then the media amplifies the narrative that the politicians want? I'm curious as to what accounts for that intensification.
And it's a question for sociologists and historians, perhaps. What makes a society abandon so completely what used to be foundations of a democratic society? I want to say it didn't start on October 2023. And it didn't start with this government either. We've been based on the occurrences of 1948. So not all the stories about what happened then are being told. And definitely not taught in Israel, not to Israeli children. We're looking into the 60th year of the occupation of the West Bank, really the holding under violence of millions of people without citizenship, without rights. All of those things have occurred. As I've said, war crimes have occurred before 2023. Terrorism has occurred before that. So we're seeing two societies in a class of violence and counter-violence, of oppression and of resistance. All of that is what makes life here. And then, yes, of course, populist regimes, populist politicians who would incite against any group if that would be helpful for them to sustain hatred and bigotry as building blocks of their policy. A media that succumbs to it without asking too many questions. Incredible for people from the outside to understand how little Israelis are made aware of even the most basic facts about how the war in Gaza is being fought, because the Israeli media does not report that.
Tal, let me interrupt. How do you know? Is there a news source? How do you know? How do you know about what's happening in Gaza? What differentiates?
The phone calls ringing. I mean, our clients are the number one source that we trust. But we also consume a lot of other media, of course, international media. We read the reports of other organizations that we trust and have been verified, UN agencies that are still operative on the ground, on social media, as much as we can verify. And the very few Israeli journalists are doing their job and reporting what's happening. It's not impossible to know, and you're right. I mean, if you're implying, I think you are, it's not impossible for any Israeli to know. It's just not accessible and not very easy to learn that your state has been involved in such terrible crimes. And yes, to be fair, I think in many other contexts, we've also seen that what is already a volatile situation is then compounded by a big tragedy, a big loss, a dramatic event. And the October 7 atrocities were such an event. Never in our history have we been invaded like that. Never have so many citizens been killed and kidnapped and tortured. That would have to have triggered something. I think those were some of my first thoughts in the days after October 7, is to know that willingly or not, intentionally or not, Hamas has unleashed something in the Israeli society that none of us can really foresee where it would take us. And unfortunately, I was right. It took us to the most horrible places.
Allow me to just redirect slightly to the question that you had raised about the level of awareness among the average Israeli, which leads me to believe that as important as your work is, there isn't a specific affection writ large attached to what you do. Do you see a differential between the older generation versus the younger generation in terms of whether or not there is an awareness or whether or not there is an attachment to the cause that you've dedicated your life to?
No, it's very complicated because even Jewish Israeli liberals have their own blind spots. So you could say generally, and polls suggest that as well, that younger generations in Israel are becoming more and more nationalist, more and more religious, less and less open to Western values, believing less and less in the value of democracy even. Such as we see, by the way, in other places around the world. We're not special in that. But we can't also just look in nostalgia towards the older generations because they were in many ways part of the regime that has been established here. And while it was perhaps easy for former generations to describe the occupation as a benevolent occupier, as a benevolent ruler, a temporary situation that soon would be resolved if only the Palestinians would agree to our terms. We've moved past that. But generally speaking, it has been less and less easy to operate and to find any kind of support for the work that we do from within Israeli Jewish society.
Let me jump us into what the courts actually look like when you walk into them. Obviously, most Americans have never seen an Israeli military court. Who do they govern? What rights exist? What rights don't exist? How significant is that distinction for your work?
So actually, most of the cases that we litigate are in the normal Israeli system. We go to the Israeli Supreme Court, the Israeli district courts. It's not very often that we would go to the military courts because in the military courts, that's where most of the security-related offenses, criminal offenses, by Palestinians in the West Bank are being adjudicated, and we treat less of those cases. But as someone who's been there, I can tell you that it's very difficult. It resembles a prison than a court, really. It's heavily guarded. It's run down. It's hot and it's messy and it's crowded. It's case after case after case. Oftentimes people don't understand, can't hear what has been said, don't understand the translators. It's especially apparent when they're adjudicating cases of Palestinian minors in detention, and we're currently looking at almost 400 such minors in Israeli detention, trying to catch a glimpse of their parents while the judge just mutters away the accusations. Most of those cases would be finalized with a plea bargain just because it makes no sense to run the full case. The conviction rates are skyrocketing. So it's something that does not resemble justice in many ways. A very difficult sight, indeed. But when we go to the Israeli courts, I mean, the facade is there. You go to a Supreme Court, it's very established and it's very sophisticated, and there are rules of conduct on how you approach and how you're being spoken to. But that too has been broken. When I mentioned that our attorneys are being attacked at the courts, this is where it happens. The halls of the Israeli Supreme Court follow our caseload, and they make a habit of showing up wherever we have a high-profile case, such as house demolitions, treatment of detainees, whatever sparks their imagination. And then our lawyers would be attacked by droves of right-wing activists flashing their cameras at our face, shouting at us the most horrible insults and slurs, trying to get a reaction out of us. All of this is being posted online to their numerous social media accounts. It's a very scary experience. We've approached the Supreme Court and the police time and time again, trying to mitigate that. But somehow it seems that free speech overrides our ability to conduct our work safely or our clients' right to being represented at court. The irony of it is that recently the same activists have been trying to attack the judges of the Supreme Court, and led by some right-wing politicians who also have made that their political signature, you could say. The same people are now blowing up court hearings at anything that they don't like, from the new government laws on the media to the role of the Attorney General. They would come and blow up and shout the same slurs and insults to the Supreme Court judges themselves, which is ironic because we've been warning them for years this is going to happen and they haven't listened. So this is where we are right now. Yeah, it does not resemble, I think, what most Americans would imagine a Supreme Court hearing looking like.
There's so much to unpack in that answer, Tal. That's very, very scary. Leah Semmel,
Same.
Is she still iconic? I look at her as a woman of fierce courage, and she always seemed real sassy to me, just like people might hurl insults at her and she would just be like, who do you think you are? She might hurl one back. I know that she's kind of gotten on in her years. Is she still active on the scene? Is she
Absolutely.
considered iconic? Tell me about her, or if you have a relationship with her.
Of course. I mean, Leah is an icon. She's alive and kicking. Her office is 2 doors down our street. She keeps litigating and representing some of the toughest cases around. I personally admire her, and also I've had the privilege of just jumping to her office and asking what she thinks about different issues that we've tackled or legal dilemmas that I've had. And she's always been very generous with her time and just pulling cases off the shelves. Oh, and I used to have that case. Maybe you should try this and that precedent, or you should argue about this and that procedure that they're not complying with. So she's definitely still with us, and in very small circles that are human rights lawyering in Israel, she's very much admired. So yeah, we have the privilege of counting her as one of our godmothers, if you like.
Yeah, I love her. I think she's so special. I had also met a gentleman when I was volunteering for a nonprofit here in the U.S. that would send medical missions to Gaza, and his name is Yotam Ben Hillel. I don't know how small your community is. Do you know him also?
Of course, it's a small community, and I know a lot of people. So
Yeah. He
yeah,
reminded me, he was my first touch point with someone that I thought of as a public defender of sorts. And because, like I said, of the work that I had done, I felt a real connection to him. Just very human, humble, grounded, compassionate, open-minded. Okay, so back to what we were talking about. I wanted to talk also about the unlawful combatants law. I had heard in an interview when you discussed this previously. So since October 7th, Israel has amended that to allow detention for months before a judge reviews the case or a lawyer is provided. Can you walk us through what that changed in your practice, who it affected, and what your organization has been fighting about it?
So if we look to detainees from the West Bank, the legal framework is the military orders. Are, of course, much less protective than normal Israeli criminal code when it comes to detainee rights, but it has been set as the norm for Palestinians, and this is what we've been dealing with. The unlawful combatants law is trying to capture a different phenomenon. It was the first time the law has been legislated was after Israel captured detainees from Lebanon and held them with no trial. And HaMoked has actually petitioned against that practice to say you can't hold people without any legal grounds for it. You have to have some kind of a legal framework. And the court agreed with us and made basically the state legislate the unlawful combatants law, which HaMoked has also protested earlier in the 2000s because it creates a legal system that is even worse than what we got accustomed to with administrative detention, because it provides less legal safeguards, as you said, longer times for judicial review of the grounds of the arrest, longer times for denial of counsel and the ability to meet with those people and to ascertain their situation. And all of this is under the framework of administrative detention, meaning that the state has no obligation to ever indict those people or bring forward evidence towards them. And there's no specific time limit. They could be held in this legal framework indefinitely. What changed after October 7th is that Israel decided to apply this law to all of the detainees from Gaza, because according to Israel, Gaza is not an occupied territory. So the military law that applies in the West Bank doesn't apply in Gaza. I don't have to explain how ridiculous that is, but that is the case. And the second thing that they did is to just take all of the time frames in that law and stretch them out. So just after October 7, when the law was amended, people could have been held without a right to see an attorney for 180 days, 6 months without seeing an attorney. And 3 months until a court would even look into their case and see what grounds they're being held on. Of course, confidential evidence presented ex parte to the judge, not even with the possibility of confronting what the merits of the case are, it's still something. The Public Committee Against Torture in Israel, the organization that I formerly ran, filed the first petition against the unlawful combatants law. And through many, many months of litigation, we have been able to gradually take some of the edge off. The holding times began to shrink back to their normal size. The judicial scrutiny time frame, the amount of time until they were able to be visited by lawyers have gradually shrunk, but are still very far from the original law the Supreme Court upheld back in 2003. So we are still left with this legal framework. This is how over 1,000 detainees from Gaza are currently being held in Israel. No prospects of trials for them yet. Very limited access to lawyers, to any kind of legal remedies, and in terrible conditions, as we've learned.
Tal, let me ask you about that. For a listener who thinks, well, there must be some security rationale, what do you tell them about what that system actually looks like when you're on the inside of the case?
First, I want them to consider that detainees from Gaza and the West Bank, it's a revolving door. We've seen people come in and out, in and out. We've seen the pictures and the testimonies of people in Gaza being loaded into trucks just for being in the wrong neighborhood when the army invaded, or in the wrong hospital. We know for certain, and Israel has also confessed to that during the litigation, that people are taken into custody en masse. It doesn't need any specific evidence. It's only after that they're being detained that the state starts sifting through them. The security systems are looking into their background and who they know and what information can be extracted from them, and then start releasing back everybody that they don't need. Stay with the ones that they do. But what does it mean that somebody is still there? Think about somebody like Dr. Abu Safian, the manager of Kamal Adwan, who's now currently in detention still. If he's a terrorist, if there's such strong evidence, why aren't they being indicted? And for so long. And Israel is so adamant that he was involved deeply, not as a cog in the machine, as a leader in Hamas, but still no indictments have been filed against him. And if that is the case for such a high-profile person, consider every business owner, shopkeeper, student being arrested in Gaza, who Israel is so determined is in fact a Hamas combatant or some other armed group combatant, but fails to show any evidence against. I would say the security grounds there are weak. They've become even weaker once all Israeli hostages have been released, which means that even people who may have information on the whereabouts of those Israelis are no longer of concern. Another thing that we've seen is that many of those people are held as bargaining chips for the next exchange deal, for the next gesture that Israel would have to give, a humanitarian gesture to Palestinians in Gaza or the West Bank. And when the political terms are right, then those people are being released. The fact of the matter, I think, eventually is you have to try them or let them go. You can't hold people in administrative detention for over 3 years and just continue as is and claim that you have the right to do it indefinitely. That's not how democracy behaves. It just isn't.
Speaking of democracy, I want to address very specifically an asymmetry that had come to my mind when I was preparing for our time together. I don't know if you would call it that or if you see it that way too, but I believe that you would. So Palestinians who are arrested and imprisoned by Israel end up going to an Israeli-run organization for help. Is that by design, meaning that as a practical matter, Palestinian lawyers can't actually represent their own people effectively in Israeli courts? Is that foreclosed? And how much of HaMoked's work depends on Palestinian lawyers and field researchers on the ground? Is there a real effort to build that capacity? And let me also just add to that, Tal, because your answers are so descriptive and comprehensive. I'm curious about how you build trust with Palestinian clients when you're asking them to place their faith in an Israeli institution, whether you feel that maybe simply out of desperation and not having any other choice, they have to surrender themselves to that idea.
Well, the answer is going to be very layered because the situation is complicated. Firstly, Palestinian lawyers can defend and do defend Palestinians in both military and Israeli courts. If they are members of the Israeli Bar Association, and many of them are, then they do and are representing Palestinian clients in all instances. For the organizational side, especially for non-profit representation, pro bono representation, that depends on each organization's strategy and set of beliefs and theory of change. And when we look at our sister organization, Palestinian organizations like Adamir, El-Haq, Al-Mizan, PCHR, all amazing human rights organizations, the strategy that they choose to operate with lately has less been of individual legal representation. They do other very significant human rights work, but not necessarily take cases into the Israeli justice system. For both political reasons, for really their theory of change is not relying on those courts for change, but rather other avenues of advocacy and engagement. But that doesn't relieve the question of this relationship being an Israeli-based organization representing Palestinians. Firstly, I would say we are registered in Israel. We've been founded by Israel, but more than half our team and half our directors are Palestinian, mostly from East Jerusalem, so not even Israeli citizens, most of them. I think that has a great effect in trust building, because the people who approach us, so the first people that they would meet and they would be represented by are people of their community. They're not externals in any way, which brings its own challenges, of course. To represent people from within your community can also be very difficult mentally. But even that doesn't relieve the full question. There is an asymmetry. The period of time where organizations like ours emerged, I think we had less of an understanding from colonialist practices to really just the separation of powers and the asymmetry of powers. I think it is important that there are organizations that come from within Jewish and Israeli societies to speak up against Israeli policies. I think no meaningful change can come without such voices. And I think when we look around to other historical contexts, it has been in part thanks to the disobedience, the dissent from within that undemocratic regimes or racist regimes have fallen. And I think mostly it keeps us with the task of being very honest with what we're doing, with what we're saying, making sure that we don't overstate or take the voices of Palestinians and how they would represent the situation and how they would tackle it. And I'm sure it's not always easy for our clients, especially from Gaza, to approach what they know to be an Israeli organization. I think we're very privileged to have their trust, and we have to treat it with the utmost respect and care to make sure that we are worthy of that trust.
That answer makes me feel very emotional.
Why is that?
But I
No,
want
not
to
at
make
all.
sure that
This
there
conversation.
will. So, Tal, you mentioned some of the organizations, some of the civil society organizations that are actually founded by or have representation by Palestinians themselves. Of course, the U.S. has designated some of those organizations. From your perspective, how significantly has that set back or handicapped the work?
Well, the first state to designate them and try and blacklist them was Israel already 6 years ago, when the Ministry of Security, by the way, not from this government, from the so-called reform government, designated 6 organizations, some of which, as I said, are our sister organizations that we founded around the same time and have shown incredible integrity and courage in criticizing and documenting not only Israeli crimes, but also Palestinian crimes. And this is something that a lot of people tend to forget. Al-Haq published an incredible report on torture in Palestinian Authority detention centers years ago and took the backlash that I'm sure it did for it. So Israel designated them and tried to convince other states to back that. It was during the Biden administration, and the US would not endorse that, and so as no other Western democracy. And then the administration of the US changed, and then all of a sudden the US designated many of the same organizations independently, supposedly, yes, of the Israeli claims. Being under US sanctions is a very difficult thing for organizations to endure. And I'm saying that because it's not impossible that Israeli organizations would only also be sanctioned at some point in time. We're seeing the attack of this administration against international rule of law, against the international court, criminal court, against UN special rapporteurs, against Palestinian organizations and other initiatives. So we're not naive enough to think that if the Israeli ministries, government, whoever politicians would want it bad enough, they wouldn't extend the same favor and designating us as well. Being under US sanctions means that any type of viability financially has become extremely jeopardized. It means that many banks would not work with you, would shut down your accounts immediately because they would not risk compliance issues. It's not even about who they believe, they just don't care. It's not a risk banks like to take. It means that you may have to let go many of your stuff. It basically means being neutralized in many ways. It also means there's a stigma behind you. It's a very, very violent and aggressive way of shutting up and silencing voices that are uncomfortable but legitimate nonetheless, and that do and deliver amazing human rights work that is so necessary. It's really one of the worst decisions that this government could have taken, but it has.
The title of this podcast has great significance for me. In addition to bearing witness by testimony, Tal, your organization itself has actually written about conditions in Israeli detention since October 7th. So you've also taken on the task of creating a documentary record. And in your 2025 annual report, you write about those conditions, the scale of it, the pace of it, also documented deaths in custody. At least 94 Palestinians between October 2023 and August 2025. And you've submitted evidence of this to the UN Committee Against Torture. Now, you've also stated publicly that what has happened in Israeli detention facilities constitutes torture implemented as state policy, not a casual claim. What I want to ask you about is what the legal and institutional response within Israel has been. And then I want to speak, and maybe less on that and more on the personal aspects of it. I would like to speak about the prisoner cases themselves and how the families around those prisoners have been affected by these arrests, detentions, and deaths.
So first to the Israeli reaction. Israel sent unprecedentedly large delegation to the UN cut deliberation. When the UN Committee Against Torture reviewed Israel in October 2025, Israel sent almost 30 delegates, supposedly to refute some of the information that we have brought forward, some of the statements by human rights organizations, some of the allegations by the committee itself. I think it did very poorly in that. It was a charade that mostly appeased the Israeli ear, but did not make any sense when trying to address concrete and evidence-based human rights allegations. I can say that it echoed deeply within Israel. On the contrary, part of this dehumanization that we've been seeing, I think, best manifested, for example, in this Detention case, where reserve military soldiers have been filmed and indicted, charged with sexually assaulting a Palestinian detainee to the state where he needed hospitalization. But the case has recently been dismissed and the charges were dropped, to the joy of both Israeli leaders and the general public. So I can say that our claims are echoing in the Israeli society. And they're definitely not making headlines. And in fact, what attracts much of the animosity towards our work is the fact that we insist on keep recording and testifying to that.
Tal, how is that possible? In what universe is it possible that there is actual video footage of something that is perhaps the greatest torture that can be conceived? That footage has been viewed around the world, and then those allegations are dismissed. How do you really make sense of that? What do you tell yourself? How do you carry it emotionally? How do you understand it? Teach us how to make sense of it.
When I
Or is
try,
it I'm sorry, yes, just an acceptance that it can't be made sense of? I apologize.
I don't think I can answer that with a story that I've heard about one of the winter soldiers, the American soldiers that came back from the Vietnam War and were charged with committing war crimes in Vietnam. And there was an interview with the father of one of those soldiers, and they asked him, "So what do you say about what they're saying your son has done?" And the father, the American father, says he didn't do it, and if he did, it was for the right reason. And this same kind of cognitive dissonance is what has been a part of Israeli occupation since its beginning. And if you want to go beyond that, you can go to 48 and you can go even beyond that. On the one hand, we're doing very difficult acts, some of them criminal, some of them inhumane. And on the other hand, we keep denying that we do, justifying. That's the dissonance, right? It's not that bad, as they say. And even if it is, that's what they deserve, or they wouldn't spare us, or look at what they've done to the Israeli hostages. I've lost all empathy after October 7th is a phrase that you would hear a lot, even among liberal crowds or formerly liberal circles in Israel. I used to be empathetic to them, but after October 7th, I just don't care anymore. A lot of things happen to the human mind when fed with fear, when fed with hatred, when being under attack, under also real attacks. After being traumatized, after being indoctrinized, a lot of things happen to the human mind, which enable both the perpetration of those acts as well as the denial and acceptance of them at the same time. I don't think the society is special in that. I'm sorry that we have to live through that human stage right now that I'm sure we are going to regret for decades, for centuries.
That's in understanding the mindset of the perpetrators or the people who maybe are not horrified by it but are even celebrating it. On the flip side, when we look at the actual detainee himself, I don't know if you are privy to this information, but are you able to, even in broad brushstrokes, say how he is doing today? I wanted to follow up and ask, to your mind, what does justice or accountability even look like for a person who survives abuse of that magnitude?
So first of all, we know the torture and ill treatment are things that would echo through a person's life indefinitely. The level of hurt, the level of trauma is something that would resonate for a lifetime. And not only through that person's lives, but also through the lives of his entire family and society. We've seen the photos of the Gazan detainees being brought back to Gaza, malnourished and really dumbstruck. You know that those people have to somehow find a way to live within society again, within their families. And with such limited resources for rehabilitation, what toll would that take? It's a very difficult fate, and this is something that would go with them for the rest of their lives. Some recover better than others. Some find a way of making sense into it. Some break, and then are lost. And this is just for the ones who are lucky enough to have been released back to their families. Consider the Palestinian detainees who've been in detention for over 3 years without any contact with the outside world. Not a phone call, not a family visit, not a visit by anyone except some lawyers were able to visit with them, but the ICRC. It really is a life in hell. Is something that I can't even imagine. I'm not going to even try.
You spoke about the visits. Al Jazeera reported that Israel has worked to keep media and independent legal professionals out of these facilities like State and Line, similar to the access restrictions at, let's say, Guantanamo. Have you been inside this particular prison, Tal? Are you allowed to make prison visits to talk to your clients at the more notorious ones, if there is such a thing, a gradation of which ones are more notorious than others, whether that's State of Mind or Ophir Prison? How much of the conditions have you been able to witness personally yourself?
So personally, I've not been there because we only send Palestinian lawyers to visit Palestinian detainees. It doesn't make sense otherwise. But my lawyers, HaMoked's lawyers, and also from where I worked before, were able to visit Detention and Rakefet, which is an underground facility in the center of Israel, and the military detention center in Ofer next to the West Bank, as well as multiple other detention facilities throughout Israel. So yes, we have retained that ability to access, and what they've witnessed and told us is horrid. From overcrowding to just random violence. I especially remember one of my lawyers telling me how her client was brought to her to meet her, obviously still bleeding from the bashing that he suffered, on his way to meet his lawyer. This is the level of immunity, and something that perhaps we haven't addressed yet, but you did ask about accountability. The level of immunity that the Israeli prison service personnel and Israeli soldiers in detention centers are enjoying is such that allows them to be as violent and as aggressive towards detainees, and knowing that they will get away with it. They will get away with anything. That's what statistics tells us, and they understand it as well as we do. So yes, we have been able to visit, but this has been one of the only open visits that anybody has conducted. And even that is very much limited. It's not confidential. It's not private. They're being harassed as they are going to meet us and as they go back. The ICRC has been banned. Journalists have been banned. Even official visitors have been very much limited in accessing those places. So there's a shroud of secrecy around everything that happens. And I know that I'm sharing a lot of information, and I'm proud that we were able to achieve that information and tell the world, because we were some of the first organizations to be able to give concrete evidence and testimony of what happens within Israeli detention centers after 2023. But it's not enough. And until those prisons are opened and until those people are released and we get to hear their actual testimonies, we will never know the full picture of what happens there.
How much do you believe that the publicity around this specific case that we discussed of the prisoner who was raped by a gang of officers, or any of the other cases, because you've just expressed an affirmation of the notion that publicity around these cases is important, but how much do you believe that that publicity increases the risk of harm to the detainee, understanding that generally prison systems culture has a well-documented reputation for being retributory?
So there definitely is a risk. Some of our clients were specifically told by prison guards, if you open your mouth, you're going to pay for it. We have eyes and ears in the courts. Don't you dare tell the judge what you've gone through, which is why we place such a high emphasis on client consent. They do nothing without their consent, and we share the concerns and we ask them, are you sure you want to file a formal complaint here? My surprise is that many detainees did keep this permission, especially the detainees from Gaza. I don't want to speak on behalf of them, but what they told us was that it's more important for them, for their voices to be heard, for what happened to them to come to light, than the risk that they are running by speaking to us or meeting with us. But that's not always the case. And there's also been instances where clients refuse to see us, saying it's just too dangerous. Don't come see me again.
Do you find that the detainees, and especially ones, as you said, from Gaza, are remarkably brave?
In my mind, put them on a pedestal. They're just normal people thrown into an impossible situation. But the levels of courage and of resilience and of humanity that some of them have displayed are incredible. And especially so as is the case of the doctors and the journalists and other groups of people that have been especially targeted. And we see their overrepresentation in the Israeli detention system right now. They are remarkable people.
Tal, for people like me, though, who are horrified by much of what we've discussed but powerless, what kinds of support actually help you in cases like this? What can we do?
First of all, echo our information, use our information in whatever circles you feel you could find influence in. If it's with your legislators or your communities, I trust our information. I know that we do our best to give you verified and thought through and analyzed information and to make it as accessible as possible. So to follow us on whatever social media platform, to follow what we publish on our website, the articles that resonate this situation is very important because we do see a trend, a change, especially with the American perception of the conflict and the US's role in that, which is still ongoing. The US has so much influence into what happens in Gaza, for example, right now, but also in the West Bank and generally in Israel. So it's very important that Americans are aware and continue to raise this issue and keep it on the agenda. So that's one thing I think that is very significant. And the other is finance. If I had more money, I could employ 10 more lawyers. I could visit 100 more detainees. I could protect 50 more families in East Jerusalem. There's so much we want to do. There's great people work. There's great work to be done. Our capacity is limited and has been shrinking gradually. So any kind of support would mean the world to us. And it would also be very heartwarming because to know that there are people on the other side of the globe like you, Mariam, who are not born into this conflict. They don't have to take that burden on them, but they do care enough to get involved is such a boost to our motivation. It's so uplifting to know, and I really would encourage anyone to reach out and do that. That would mean the world to us.
You're not simply a human rights lawyer. You've described yourself that way, but you're also an Israeli criticizing Israeli policy. And I want to ask you about what it has cost you. We've spoken about cost throughout this conversation, but I really want to know what it has cost you personally to do this work and to speak publicly about what you've seen. As an aside, Tal, my belief is that the more we humanize our stories and make ourselves relatable to people who may not have heard of us before, is the way we bring people into the fold. You can speak about the work and that still remains an abstract, it's theoretical. But when you describe who you are and that you're a mother and you wake up and you make breakfast and send your kid to school with a lunch bag and you pick him up after school and you can't wait for him to give you his artwork from the day, like those are things that are universal, or they're supposed to be universal. And so to my question, I'm trying to find out, not politically, but personally, what relationships have you lost? What has changed in you and how you understand your own identity as an Israeli? Have you felt like an outsider among your own people? What kind of reception are you given among mainstream Israelis?
It's a difficult and sad story, you could say, in a sense, because yes, there are, I don't know that I've lost relationships because of that. My family still loves and accepts me, but some of the Shabbat dinner conversations that we're having, a Friday night meal with all the family can really escalate to a shouting contest sometimes. It has happened more when I was younger. I think as I grew older, I understood that we need to find another way to communicate around what we will never agree on. Being raised Orthodox, being raised very Zionist, and my family prides itself in our Zionist heritage. It's not something they can just shake off. I'm never going to be a person other than what I am and where I've been raised. I try to approach it with criticism, but with compassion, to understand that my forefathers did what they thought was best and gave me the skills and the ability to do what I think now is not only best, but is really my obligation. It's been harder and harder to talk about Palestinian human rights, especially since Gaza. Harder and sometimes even scary. Not to every person that I meet would I tell exactly where I work. Wiggle my way around it. So what do you do? I'm a lawyer. Where? In a nonprofit. So what do you do? We do, this and that. And only if I really am pushed to the corner would I absolutely, spill out what I'm saying, because it could be dangerous. Sometimes has been.
Sometimes you have received death threats, Tal?
Not specifically, but I've received a lot of slurs and sexual harassment over social media whenever I appear on the news. Yes, that has happened. It has happened. Not to the point where I'm fearing my life. I'm not there yet. I'm not saying that to be a hero. It's an honest assessment of the level of risk that I'm facing. But to really understand that you are such a minority of your society. We're talking about less than 3% of Jewish Israelis probably who hold the same views as we do. It could be very discouraging and it could be very long.
What do you do to keep yourself in it? Is there something special that you do for yourself? Is it a camaraderie with your friends? Or is it that you simply can't turn away because now you can't unsee what you've seen? What keeps you rooted in this work?
I mean, all of the above. First of all, the comrades. I mean, the people that I have really the incredible honor to be working with, and the friends that I've made along the way, and people that have gone through the same stages in life, been disillusioned by the same things that I have. And also people from all over the world who teach me how to be in defiance and still live well and still be happy and still be healthy, and to accept this as a privilege to live a life that is made out of really fighting for what you believe in. It's very romantic, really. How many of us get the chance to do that? I'm really doing my dream job, as far as I'm concerned, as hard as it is. And the commitment to the people that we are representing, and the courage and inspiration that I draw from them, from Palestinian resilience. It's not something that I can ever really emulate, but I can aspire to. And I can take comfort in the fact that I can somehow support it. And if that's what I do, and if that's all that I do, and if I never win the occupation, and even if I don't live to see the day the Israeli occupation ends, I can take comfort that I took a small part in trying to dismantle it towards the future. And that's a great comfort.
I have said that the purpose of putting this podcast together has been to feature the people I know, the people I have met who are extraordinary and who are carrying extraordinary burdens. And surprisingly, every single one of them is a person who would deny that characterization of himself or herself and say, I'm just an ordinary person doing what I can from where I am. I cannot tell you how profound our time together has been. This is one of those conversations for me that is life-changing. And I pray that people who listen to it are going to be inspired by who you are, Tal, and the work that you do, that they will recognize the inherent value and that they will make their contributions, because I know many people who care about this issue deeply. So that is a very sentimental way of saying I want to thank you for bearing witness today. I have greatly appreciated our time together.
Thank you so much, Miriam. Really, this has been such a great talk and such a wonderful opportunity to reflect. And thank you for all the warm and kind words. I can't wait to share them with my entire team, because
I can't wait to see you in person.
They deserve more than I do.
Yes, please pass them on to everyone if possible. And I look forward to a time when we are together in person.
So, okay.
Tal,
You
thank you
too,
so
Monique.
very
Thank you
much.
so much.